All right. Well, welcome to our second 2026 spring lecture. This is the May lecture. We'll do one more, and then we'll move into a summer series. I'll do 3 in the summer and 3 in the fall, and I've already kind of got them sketched out in my head, so I'll maybe tease a little bit here at the end about where we're going. But tonight's lecture is on Albrecht Dürer, the Leonardo of the North. He's a German artist. He's a contemporary of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, although sadly there's no evidence that they ever met, but he knew of their work, and he did make a couple of interesting trips to Italy that I will talk about. And he is sort of widely celebrated as the greatest artist north of the Alps ever. And we'll talk about why that might be true. You can maybe see here at the beginning, this is a self-portrait that he did when he was 13. You get a sample of sort of how great and how skilled and talented he was. So that's where we're going. Yeah, he's one of the first artists to do self-portraits. They were not a thing until the late 1400s. Artists rarely did this. In fact, artists didn't always even sign their work. We have a lot of works from the Middle Ages. We don't know the name of the artist. So Dürer, of course, signed his work and did a variety of self-portraits. I have one more that I'll show you a little bit later. So at 13, at 22, and at 27. All right, so the Francis Schaeffer Study Center is the sponsor of all of these lectures. We were founded in 2004, so we've been going for 22 years now. And our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. And I'm going to be doing a little bit of both history and art tonight. It's named for the influential theologian and apologist Francis Schaeffer, very heavily influenced, who believed that all truth is God's truth and thought that the arts were worthy of Christian investigation and understanding. And you got some pictures of our students down there. In addition to this lecture series, the Schaeffer Study Center offers a high school program that's built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization, beginning with the ancient world in 9th grade, finishing with the end of the 20th century. Actually, now we actually do get into the 21st century. Now, I got to update this slide. I keep thinking, somebody says, oh, yeah, it was 20 years ago. And I think, oh, 1980. And people go, no, like 2006. I'm going, wait. Yeah, so we are a quarter of the way in to the 21st century. It's a quarter of it is in the rearview mirror. I can't get used to that. So Cindy and I have been married for 48 years. Our 49th anniversary is coming up in August. Thank you. We have 12 children, 3 sons, 9 daughters, 22 grandchildren so far. I have an undergraduate degree from Davidson College, a master's from Stanford University. I have been a historian and a teacher and an author pretty much since my high school days. I've done a lot of other things along the way. I was a college professor for a while. I was city manager here in Mount Juliet for 7 years, kind of a weird sidetrack. I'm still the publisher at Greenleaf Press, and along with my wife, we are the co-directors of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. And it's a great joy that I can go to work and teach alongside my wife. It's just a wonderful blessing. So, I'm going to get started this way. Tell me something you already know about Albrecht Dürer.
He knew how to get paid.
He knew how to get paid. And you will probably recognize some of his artwork. Because a lot of it you have seen, a lot of it has become sort of iconographic and stereotypical. Anybody ever seen the praying hands? That's Dürer. And I didn't understand until I researched for this speech tonight. I didn't understand where that picture came from, but I know. And I'm going to tell you how that came to be. Anything else? Okay, so I'm working with a blank slate. That's all right.
Was he German?
He's German. Yes, he is. He is from Nuremberg, north of the Alps, just north of Bavaria. The Bavarians like to claim him, but he's not Bavarian. Bavaria has annexed north from its central territory. The people in Nuremberg swear they're not Bavarians. They are from Franconia. Thank you very much. And we'll talk a bit about what all that means. So 1471 to 1528. And our primary sources, we have personal letters, especially to one of his close friends, Willibald Pirkheimer, who actually was one of the government officials, a magistrate in Nuremberg. He kept a diary, especially toward the end of his life. He was in the Netherlands for 2 years, and we have diary entries. He saw some of the first shipments of artifacts from the New World that had come back from Mexico, and was very intrigued with Native American art and symbolism. There was a huge gold sun with rays and a moon out of silver, and he sketched them and was just fascinated with what he was seeing from the New World. He wrote a family chronicle, described what he knew of his grandfather and his mother and father, and his own marriage. He did not have any children. We'll talk about that. He wrote a couple of books. He wrote a couple of books for artists. He wrote books about design and proportion, and he also wrote a book about the business side of being an artist. Here's how to make sure you make money. And he was very good. He was a wealthy man by the time he died. We have letters by his friends and associates, some that he wrote to them, some that they wrote to him. All of these are preserved, and actually most of them have been transcribed and printed. He is a citizen of the city of Nuremberg, and when he became famous, of course, then the city council took notice of him. He actually was elected to the city council toward the end of his life. The imperial court in Germany, he was friends with 2 emperors, and then, of course, there are church records. We know where he was baptized. We know where he's buried. Oh, I meant to make that the last one that came up. Well, okay, we'll start here. Secondary sources. Everybody goes back to Panofsky. He wrote a Life and Art of Albrecht Dürer in 1943. It's kind of made the case for Dürer as a huge, significant, influential artist of the Renaissance and in subsequent centuries. He's a little bit biased. Princeton University is a professor of art history there. He does not understand Dürer's religious convictions very well, and when a lot of his religious iconography he misses. But his interpretation of what Dürer's paintings mean and his analysis of Dürer's style and how it changed over time, everybody goes back to him. And I have his book over here. The Life and Art of Albrecht Dürer by Panofsky. So if you want to take a look, this is now 80 years old. Hard to believe, but it is. Dürer, His Art and Life, Fedja Anzaluski, I have that book over there as well, was curator in Berlin, so this is a translation. He organized an exhibition of Dürer's works that came and toured the U.S. in the 1970s, and that's almost a catalog of what he brought to show. Jane Hutchinson wrote a biography in 1990 that's still influential, corrects Panofsky on a few important points. David Hotchkiss Price in 2003, more recent, of the academic histories, biographies of him, that's, I think, one of the best. And then Jeffrey Chip Smith in 2012. This is the one I enjoyed the most in working on this lecture. Phaidon is just a wonderful publisher. This is printed on glossy paper, and when he wants to talk about a piece of art, he gives you a full-color reproduction. And he's a very good art historian, and he understands religious iconography better than Panofsky does. He references Panofsky in the beginning here, but this is very readable, and this is the one I would recommend if you want to know more. And then there is a new one from 2023, Renaissance Live series. I have not read it yet, but it is getting very, very good reviews. David Exergian, Albrecht Dürer, Art and Autobiography. So I always want to start with geography and genealogy, and we talk a little bit about geography. If you've come to some of the other lectures, you know sort of where I'm going here. When I talked about Frederick the Wise and Frederick the Great, I gave everybody a bit of an introduction to the history of Germany. In 1471, it was incredibly chaotic and confused. There were 400 separate political jurisdictions, and all of them were fiercely independent of the emperor. The emperor had a hard time commanding any kind of resources. The emperor wanted to go to war. He had to sort of go hand in begging cup to get the various electors and princes to send troops for his imperial army. He had no real army of his own. Now, the Habsburg family, a little later, that changed. They had built up more and more territory that they personally owned and ruled. But this was crazy. Ecclesiastical princes, bishops who ruled cities, collected taxes, held court. Secular princes, dukes, margraves, landgraves, who ruled larger territories. Secular counts, who ruled smaller territories. And then there was this curious phenomenon of 80 free imperial cities. They were not under the jurisdiction of any of these others. They had charters directly from the emperor. They elected their own city governments. They paid taxes directly to the emperor and not to anybody else. So it's not like a U.S. city that belongs to a state and everybody pays state taxes. This was a city that was independent of everything around it. And there were 80 of them in the late 1400s. Yeah, here's a map. And it's actually simplified. This is from 1350, and you see the color codes, the various families, and of course they're all related to each other. There's cousins and second cousins and nieces and nephews, but it's a mess. And the red lines are the ostensible boundaries of the empire. Everybody within the red boundaries ostensibly owes allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor. Voltaire has the famous quip that the Holy Roman Empire is 3 lies in 3 words, because it was never holy, it was not Roman, and it was not an empire. So, but you see, it extended all the way down across the Alps into northern Italy. This was part of the Holy Roman Empire. The emperors and the northern Italian cities were sometimes at war with each other. They were supposed to pay taxes and be loyal and contribute troops. Bohemia, Brandenburg, Saxony, Austria, all regional independent powers.
Rob, who is ruling over there in Hungary?
I'm sorry?
Hungary? Who is ruling?
Oh, Hungary. Hungary was part of the Kingdom of Hungary here. Eventually, Austria-Hungary becomes a Habsburg possession. And they're very fiercely protective of the territory that they rule that's outside the domain of the empire. For a while, it was independent. Poland was independent. And then you have this thing up here that's called the Teutonic Order. Go watch my lecture on Frederick the Great, because that's Prussia. And the Elector of Brandenburg acquired that by marriage, and then he wanted to be a king, and he could be a king in Prussia because it was outside the empire. We could go on about German political things. What I want to talk about, the 7 electors, we talked about this. 3 archbishops, 4 secular princes. You'll see here why this comes up. The free imperial cities are what I want to talk about, because that's how we position Dürer. That's what you need to understand Dürer and his life and his setting. There's 75 to 85 of them. I've got on this slide eventually the 7 largest, most powerful. Nuremberg is number 2. The only larger free imperial city was Cologne. Nuremberg, in Dürer's lifetime, probably had 35 to 40,000. It was a manufacturing center. It was already a printing center. There was already a printing industry in Nuremberg. The press, of course, Gutenberg, the Gutenberg Bible is 1455. So this is only 16 years. Dürer is born 16 years after the printing press is invented. That's a key detail for his life. There were also merchants and bankers. The Nuremberg merchants had trading houses in Venice and in Antwerp and in London, so that there was this constant traffic back and forth. And Dürer's family is from Hungary. His grandfather was a goldsmith in Hungary. His father was born in Hungary, trained as a goldsmith, and came into the empire and settled in Nuremberg and eventually became a citizen of the city. Dürer is born in Nuremberg. It is also the place where the imperial regalia were kept. The regalia would be the crown, and they had a piece of the true cross, and they had the lance, the Holy Lance. It's the lance that was used by the Roman soldier to kill Jesus. So they had the lance. All of that was in the castle in Nuremberg. And so the emperors would come to Nuremberg regularly. If you go to Nuremberg, the castle is just a gorgeous. You've been there. Yeah, we've walked through that castle. Here are some of the other cities. You will recognize some of these. This is ranked by population. Augsburg, Strasbourg, Lübeck, Ulm, Regensburg, and then it goes on for another 80. Here are the 45 most important. There'll be a quiz later. This is actually a printed sheet done in Germany. I wanted to do that because in the top row, in the center, is Nuremberg. There's the coat of arms. Of course, each city has its own coat of arms. They're very zealous and proud of their reputations. Think cities with NFL football teams. Yeah, these are the imperial cities.
Well, I think there's some copy paste going on there. I'm seeing a lot of.
You think? Yeah. A lot of iconography, and the eagle, of course, is the symbol of the empire. So yeah, you see the eagle quartered. This is the shield of Franconia. Okay, so the life of Albrecht Dürer, 6 acts. We're going to talk about his youth and apprenticeship. His Wanderjahre, this was standard for anybody going through an apprenticeship. You apprenticed to a master, whatever trade or craft you were learning, for 3 years, typically, from 15 to 18. When you completed your 3-year apprenticeship, then you went out on a Wanderjahr, and you visited other cities, and you were accepted as what's called a journeyman, and you were able to go to work for other masters in the same trade and learn and benefit from the techniques that they might have that you weren't taught from the master that taught you. So he's on a Wanderjahr for 5 years. Frankfurt, the Netherlands, Colmar, Basel, Strasbourg. At the end, he briefly goes to Italy, building a business. So in 1495, he's 24 years old. And he starts his own shop, his own workshop in Nuremberg. And we'll talk about what happens in those 10 years. He gets famous and rich. And we'll talk about how that happened. Act 4, he goes back to Italy. He gets a huge commission. Interestingly enough, I'll talk in more detail about this. He gets a huge commission, probably $250,000 commission, from the German merchants in Venice who have their own church. And they want an altarpiece, and they don't want it done by an Italian artist. They want it done by a German artist. And Dürer is famous enough by then that they're willing to pay him probably $250,000 to come down and do the altarpiece. And we have letters back and forth that he writes. He doesn't like Italy all that much. He goes back to Italy. We talk about he's an imperial artist for 2 different emperors. So in Nuremberg, for the emperor that the Germans affectionately call Kaiser Max, Maximilian I, who's a Habsburg. And then when Kaiser Max dies in 1519, he's succeeded by his grandson, who is Charles V. And Dürer manages to make the transition from the grandfather to the grandson as the imperial artist. He gets an annual subsidy from the emperor, although he's a little nervous for a year or so, trying to make sure that the new emperor will continue the subsidy that he was getting from the old emperor. So he actually spent a year in Antwerp making sure that the subsidy would be confirmed and continue. And he comes back at home, the last 7 years of his life in Nuremberg, dies in 1528. So let's talk about his youth and education first. His grandfather, master goldsmith in Hungary. His father, trained in Hungary, moved to Nuremberg in 1455. That's the year Gutenberg starts printing Bibles. 12 years later, so he becomes a journeyman to a goldsmith in Nuremberg, and he marries the boss's daughter. And he doesn't have any sons. So he inherits the goldsmith shop, became a citizen, got married, Barbara Holper, daughter of a master goldsmith for whom he had been apprenticed. Albrecht, born 4 years later, he was their third child. 2 older siblings died young. Eventually, there are 2 younger brothers, Andreas, born in 1484, who's 13 years older, or 13 years younger than Albrecht, and Hans, born in 1490, who's 19 years younger than Albrecht. His parents had 18 children, and only these 3 sons survived to adulthood. He apprenticed to his father at 12 in the goldsmith shop. And this portrait that I showed you, the self-portrait, he did at 13. It's in what's called silver point, which is where you do a treated background and you then inscribe it with a tool and it brings out the shading and the lines. But as a goldsmith, you have to learn not only some of the principles of business, you have to be able to weigh and count and do arithmetic and keep track of your expenses and all of that. But there's also a great deal of artistic sketching ability that's required. And one of the masterpiece, that's every apprentice has to do a masterpiece in order to complete his apprenticeship, was to do a chalice or a cup with designs worked into the exterior of the chalice. So Dürer did that, and his father taught him you have to have a very detailed, precise, completed sketch of what you want it to look like at the end before you start working the piece of metal. So there's a great deal of artistic ability required and a great deal of artistic ability that Dürer learns and masters as an apprentice to his father, the goldsmith. His father was probably the most prominent goldsmith in the city of Nuremberg, and it's a city of 40, 50,000 people. At 15, his father was actually a little reluctantly, but over time had come to recognize that his son had more skill with pen and paper than he did with anything else, and he actually took more joy from drawing and sketching than he did from working and building things out of gold or silver. And so he apparently approached his son and said, would you rather be an artist than a goldsmith? Which was a bit of a step down at the time because goldsmiths were very highly sought after and had lots of prestige. An artist was sort of treated like a blue-collar work. Artists basically got commissioned to paint portraits and paint. They weren't considered very high status. And Dürer did not think long about it. He was apprenticed to Michael Wohlgemuth, who was a neighbor. Dürer's father and Michael Wohlgemuth lived on the same street in Nuremberg, so he really didn't have to go very far. And he's, of course, still living at home. Wohlgemuth was not only a painter, but his workshop of artists produced woodcuts for the books being published by Anton Koberger. Koberger is one of the leading printers in all of Germany, and absolutely the leading printer in Nuremberg. He had, I think, 20 printing presses and employed 100 people. Some of you might have heard of something called the Nuremberg Chronicle, which he printed, Koberger. But the woodcuts, the illustrations for the Nuremberg Chronicle, which was a chronicle of the entire world, the history of the world from creation on, and all the geography of the world, the woodcuts were done in the workshop of Michael Wohlgemuth. And we don't know which one of them, or which ones of them, Dürer might have worked on, but we're certain that he did contribute to that work. So in his late teens, he's working on illustrations for a book that's being written. Oh, and Anton Koberger was his godfather. So it's a small world. Dürer completed his apprenticeship in late 1489. And that's his apprenticeship as a painter. This apparently is his masterpiece. This is the piece he painted to demonstrate to his master that he had completed his apprenticeship and was ready to begin accepting independent commissions. This is a portrait of his father. He was 18 years old. And this is his mother. Barbara and Albrecht Sr. Everybody calls him Albrecht Sr., and the son they just call Dürer. Oh, I will keep that up. So after having done those oil paintings, he went off to study with other painters. Martin Schongauer was a famous painter in northern Germany, and his father recommended him. There were some connections there. He arrived in Colmar and discovered that Schongauer had died about a week or two before he arrived. So that wasn't going to work out. But Schongauer's brother referred him to Basel, and Basel is another one of the great printing centers. Basel is where Erasmus went to work about this same time. Venice, Basel, Nuremberg were the great centers of the printing industry by the 1490s. He went down the Rhine after a few years to Strasbourg, which is a German imperial city at that point. I know it's in France now, but the Germans don't even recognize that. If you spell it with an O, they will look at you cross-eyed, because Strasbourg is a German name, and it was a German-speaking imperial city for a long time. Something about 20th century world wars, it's too complicated to get into, but yeah, it wound up in France. And Dürer was there for a year or so. In July, he returned to Nuremberg, and this is his own diary entry in his own family chronicle. When I returned home, Hans Frey made a deal with my father and gave me his daughter, Miss Agnes by name, and with her he gave me 200 florins and held the wedding. It's on Monday before Margaret's Day in the year 1494. He's 23 years old. 200 florins, by the way, is probably about $400,000. They're 200 golden florins. So, yeah, he's pretty well staked and set up at this point. A month or two after his wedding, he sketched this of his wife, and he titled it Mein Agnes. Panoski doesn't think they had a happy marriage, but there's been a succession of revisions who just say Panoski is full of it. Panoski thinks this demonstrates that she was cold, withdrawn, and I agree with the later analysis who say, no, he just caught her in a thoughtful, pensive mood. He probably saw her sitting at a table and said, hold that, let me get my sketchbook. And thankfully, we still have it. So after all of this, and after going back to Nuremberg and getting married, within a few months of his wedding, he left Nuremberg for Venice, Italy. Now, he was there only from August to May, so it was only about 9 months. We're not quite sure where Agnes was. She didn't go with him to Venice, but they may have both left Nuremberg because of an outbreak of the plague. She had relatives in Innsbruck, and it's possible that she stayed with them. It's a little odd to think of a guy just 4 months married, leaving, and being gone for 9 months. But we'll see, he and Agnes actually had a very interesting partnership. He's back, 1495, setting up his own workshop in Nuremberg. Agnes is helping him. He's already getting commissions from churches and merchants who want artwork. He receives an important commission from Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Whoops, should be a Y there on the end. He prepared woodcuts for an illustrated edition of the Book of Revelation. This was sort of his own project. This was his first big independent project. And he knows from his work as an apprentice at Wolgemuth's studio and at Koberger's printing press, and they're all on the same street in downtown Nuremberg. They're just a couple of houses away from each other. And it's, the workshops are on the ground floor and the second floor, and the residences are on the top 2 floors. He knows from all of that how printing works and how you do woodcuts and the mechanics of it. And so he decides he wants to be not just the artist, but also the publisher. And he acquires a press of his own. It might have been sold to him by Koberger. It could have been leased to him, but Koberger had 20 printing presses. So Dürer acquiring one from him is not that big a deal. And Koberger gave him type. It's also very important. And Dürer is doing the woodcuts. About this same time, he forms a friendship with a gentleman named Willibald Pirkheimer, the most learned man in Nuremberg, who had a huge library and who instructed Dürer, introduced him to the classics of the ancient world, and advised him on his commissions and his iconography and his symbolism and so forth. Well, this is at age 26. This is 2 or 3 years into his independent business skills. 1498. Now, the interesting thing about that year and about that book is there was like a huge Y2K phenomenon, is the only way I know to describe it. There were lots of people who thought 1500 would be the end of the world. And so a book illustrating John's revelation, published in 1498, had kind of a huge market appeal. Because everybody thought, well, John wrote about, what's going to happen when Jesus comes back, and he might be coming back in a year or two, so maybe we should read up on it. Dürer actually was thinking through this. Did Koberger do the printing, or did he loan or lease a press? We now think that actually Dürer had set up his own press. If you visit his house in Nuremberg, which has been restored, there is a printing press in the house. Full-page woodcuts and full folio size with the text on the facing page. And he did 2 versions. He did a version with the Latin text of the book of Revelation. And then he also did a version with the German text. So it's not true that Luther's Bible was the first Bible in German. It's that Luther's translation was so incredibly good. And it was the first complete New Testament. This was only the book of Revelation. 1,000 copies were printed, maybe more. We think there are about 30 or 40 known to have survived. The last publicly recorded sale of a complete bound first edition, 1498, occurred in 2008. It sold for $1.4 million to a National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where it is in storage, almost never shown, because you don't want to expose it to sunlight. Every now and then you can watch, go check their website. If you're going to Washington, D.C., check and see if the Dürer Apocalypse is going to be on display. His wife and his mother became his business managers and sales representatives. They traveled independently, both of them, to the various fairs in Germany, and they took copies of the books with them. He had other merchants who went out as well. He sort of worked out a franchise distribution deal and made a good deal of money doing it. He exported to booksellers on commission in Italy, the Netherlands, France, Spain, England. You could buy Dürer anywhere. And this book made him famous throughout Europe. And this is only 43 years after Gutenberg printed the first Bible. The printing press, this is like the early days of the internet. This is like, when we still have dial-up AOL. But it works. He then began to move from woodcuts to engraving. Engraving lets you do finer detail. It's more intricate. It takes longer to engrave a printing plate than it does to cut into a wood block. They used hardwood, usually pearwood blocks. But you can get some richer detail from all of that. Here is a facsimile. I wish I had a picture of a real one, but I couldn't find one. But this is a facsimile reprint, the exact same size, and I love the fact that I've got the hands in there for scale, of what Dürer's Apocalypse looked like, with the text and the illustrations. And this, of course, is the famous 4 horsemen of the Apocalypse. And these sold. They sold. He went on, 1504. This is not a woodcut. This is from a metal plate that he's engraved. He does Adam and Eve. This was sold as an independent, standalone print. roughly 8 by 10 size. It's done on copper plate. Each sheet sold for 1 gulden, which is roughly $1,000. One page by Dürer. Yeah, if you find one of these somewhere in an attic, call me. Because it's worth a lot more than that now. Likely made 200 to 500 impressions, netting him $200 to $500,000 in income just off this one. Now, it probably took him 6 months to do that one engraving. 1505, we're now to Act 4 now. He's famous, and he's become very wealthy. Thank you very much. He traveled south for a second visit to Italy, to Venice. He had received a commission from the German merchants who had their own residence and warehouses and a sort of a shopping distribution center there, and they had their own church, San Bartolomeo. The altarpiece that Dürer painted is no longer there. It was bought by one of the Austrian emperors and went first to Vienna and then to Prague, which is where it is now. His commission was probably about $250,000 from the German merchants to come paint this one altarpiece. And this is a letter he sent back to Pirkheimer, to his buddy who is the political leader in Nuremberg. I have a panel to paint for the Germans, for which they are to pay me 110 florins. That's the gold coin. It will not cost me as much as 5. That's what he'll spend on materials.
Nice little markup there.
And there it is. Yeah.
But how long did that take him, Rob?
He thought he could do it in 3 months. It wound up taking him 4 to 5. He was a very rapid painter. I'll show you one in just a minute that he did in 5 days. But yeah, so this is the enthronement of Mary. You see the angels up here. You see this is a Dominican. This is St. Dominic, actually. And in the foreground, very interesting, you have the Pope and the Emperor, because the German merchants commissioned it. We don't know the identities of the other people in here, but they're probably specific German merchants who contributed money to the altarpiece and who wanted to have their pictures included in there. But of course, up in the upper right-hand corner here, Dürer puts himself, which is one of the ways that artists can sign their paintings. Here's the one he did in 5 days. Christ Among the Doctors, painted in 1506 while he was in Venice. The inscription is on a bookmark here. I think you can probably see it here. There's a book. This is Jesus in the temple among the doctors. And there's a little piece of paper, a bookmark sticking out of this volume here, and it's got Dürer's monogram and the date, 1505, on it. And he wrote, yeah, I did this in 5 days. Now, he had been doing studies. He had been doing studies of the faces and the hands for a number of years. He'd sort of thought about this particular painting. It's a little bit unique in the focus of the painting, this circle around the hands, and Jesus' hands here making a point, and some of the Jewish scholars have hands resting on a book, or a hand opening a book, or a hand attempting to show him a book. So there's 3 figures over here and 3 figures over here. And of course, this is Jesus at 12 in the temple. Jesus among the doctors.
Wouldn't those have been scrolls?
It's anachronistic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got books, because that's what he thought. Yeah. Next year, the Heller altarpiece. Heller was a wealthy merchant in Nuremberg. He was commissioning the artwork for his family's church in the suburbs. And I think he's in here somewhere, but I'm not quite sure. I think he's one of the figures down here, either over here or maybe over there. So he paid for all of this, but I want you to look at, and that might be Heller there, actually, at this particular figure here who's got his hands folded in prayer. because, and yeah, here's the close-up, because this is Dürer's sketch for that altarpiece. And this is the famous iconic praying hands that is now used in so many different ways, because all of Dürer's artwork is public domain now, so anybody can use it and doesn't have to pay anybody anything for it. So we have the sketch that he did, that he used as his guide when he painted the painting. And now you know. 1511. So we're now 13 years after he got famous and rich from doing the Apocalypse. He decides to do the story of Jesus' life. 36 woodcuts. It starts actually with Adam and Eve and the fall from the garden, and then moves from those two to the Annunciation by the angel Gabriel, through Jesus' birth, his ministry, his arrest and trial and crucifixion and burial. 36 woodcuts, and it's small, perhaps 1,000 sets. One of his biggest commercial successes, it rapidly sold out. It sold for a quarter of a gulden. So maybe $250 if you could catch it on sale, $250 to $500. And it was, well, this is one of the pages from that piece. This is a Dürer print done by him on his press in 1511. And he probably made $500,000 or more from this. Starts with the fall of man, the expulsion from the garden, 34 scenes telling the story of Jesus. Very popular. 1514, he turned to engraving, and these are standalone engravings like the Adam and Eve. These are, full folio size, 8 by 10, 8 by 14. Night, Death, and the Devil is also a famous one, not an illustration for a book, but done as a standalone piece, printed on his own press, and then sold probably for $1,000 or so. St. Jerome in his study, and this is a really interesting one. It's the only one that's got a title in it, Melancholia. The title is actually up here on this little scroll in the upper left corner. And these just further increased his fame, but you can see he's focusing on these printed works, because you can make more money from a printed work than you can from an oil painting. And he understood the printing press. Talked about this phase in his life towards the end. He's now well-known, wealthy, accomplished, established artist. This is a portrait he painted of Kaiser Max the year that he died. But Kaiser Max had already granted him an annual subsidy. Kaiser Max came to Nuremberg rather frequently. It was one of the most important cities and sort of the leading candidate. Anytime there was an imperial diet, a collection of all the German nobility, it was typically held in Nuremberg. Kaiser Max died in January of 1519. His grandson was elected emperor in June of that year. But his grandson is living in the Low Countries. He's living in what is now Belgium. He's in Antwerp. That's where he had been born and grown up. So Dürer and Agnes traveled to Antwerp to make sure that the grandson is going to continue the subsidy that had been paid by the grandfather. And they're there for about a year. Charles V arrived in Antwerp in September. Dürer saw him frequently. Dürer had taken big cases of his artwork with him, and because everybody's coming to the Netherlands to see the new emperor and to win his favor. He's only 20 years old. He was born in 1500. But he did charcoal portraits, occasional oil portraits. He did one for the King of Denmark. He attended the coronation of Charles V in Aachen. And in November, the grandson confirmed the annual subsidy. Says, yes, we'll continue to pay that. So the mission, the political mission that he and his wife undertook was successfully concluded. They left to return to Nuremberg. And this then is his last painting. because between 1520 and 1526, there's this little university professor who comes on the scene and whom Luther knows about, or whom Dürer knows about. In fact, we know Dürer had been buying Luther's pamphlets from the time they were first published. He bought them in Antwerp. He bought them, and he wrote to some of his dealers, said, hey, anytime you see an essay or a book or a pamphlet by Dr. Luther, buy a copy and send it to me. So this is interesting on a number of levels. It was nicknamed the Four Apostles, but it's not the Four Apostles. And you'll sometimes see it referred to that way in art books as the Four Apostles, but it's not the Four Apostles. It's the only one of them who's an apostle is John. Well, Peter, I guess. John and Peter. The only one who's a gospel writer is John, and then Mark, and then Paul. Was not commissioned for any church. Dürer conceived of this, painted it himself, and gifted it to the city of Nuremberg. It hung in City Hall. And one of the reasons it hung in City Hall is because there were 4 inscriptions. They're kind of missing here, but they were inscribed. This is painted on wood panels at the bottom. And from John, he quoted John's letter, not John's gospel. 1 John 4, 1 through 3. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. And from Peter, again, an inscription inscribed at the bottom is from 2 Peter 2. False prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in false opinions. 2 Peter 2, 1 through 3. From Mark, it's a quote from Jesus, Mark chapter 12, 38 to 40. Jesus, in his teaching, said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and the place of honor at the feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. And then from Paul, let me get down here to this, 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. Dürer selected these verses. Understand this, in the last days, there will come times of difficulty, for people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power. Avoid such people. For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins and led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. Now, eventually, about 50, 60 years after Dürer died, the king of Bavaria bought this painting from the city of Nuremberg. They had fallen on hard times and they needed the money, and he bought them. He was a staunch Catholic. He had the 4 inscriptions on the bottom, sawed off. But that painting it's in the Gemälde Gallery, the art museum in Munich. Oh, and John's Gospel, which he has open. He's holding a copy of his own gospel. He has it open to John 1. But the text is in German, and it's Luther's translation. So you can sort of see where, because nobody paid and nobody commissioned this. This was Dürer's own composition as a gift for the city, and not given to a church, but hung in City Hall. Yeah. His last engravings, Frederick, Duke of Saxony, Willibald Pirkheimer, his friend, the magistrate of the city of Nuremberg, and Philip Melanchthon, Professor of Wittenberg, who had also come to Nuremberg at the request of the city council and helped to found a school. So one of the first gymnasium, one of the first preparatory schools for students going on to the university, founded in Nuremberg, and they begged Melanchthon to come and take the position as the director of the school. And he said, no, what I'm doing in Wittenberg with Dr. Luther is more important. So he went back, but he spent some time, and Dürer sketched him and then did these engravings of him. This was done, this was the last image of Frederick done. He died the year after Dürer did that. So, and he writes about Luther's trial and his despair over Luther being condemned as a heretic. When Luther is kidnapped on his way home from the Diet of Worms, there's a diary entry from Dürer where he says, who will save the church now from the corruption if Dr. Luther has been taken from us? Erasmus of Rotterdam, will you step up and speak out? And then, of course, because nobody knew where Luther was. He had left the trial, was on his way home, and some guys on horseback came out of the woods, put a bag over his head, and rode off with him, and nobody knew where he was. And Dürer writes in his diary just in anguish, like, you know, if Luther has been taken from us, what will we do? When he died, Luther actually wrote to Agnes his consolation and praised Dürer as not only the greatest artist north of the Alps, but also a man of deep faith and piety. He said, and it showed in his art. So what's his reputation at the end? 1528, he dies. This is a portrait of him. He was only in his 50s when he died. But this is a contemporary in Nuremberg who did that woodcut of him. He was obviously enormously gifted and talented, skills as an artist. He was a master of a variety of styles, media, technique, different composition. He's a Renaissance man and an astute businessman, and he understood the printing press. He was known publicly as a passionate admirer and supporter of Luther. It did not make him popular outside the city. Nuremberg itself embraced the Reformation. But outside Nuremberg, in the other parts of Germany, it was not safe to be publicly identified. Interestingly, the imperial cities, you know, the 100 or so imperial cities, they were the first ones to embrace the Reformation. It was an urban phenomenon. Because they were independent. And the city commissions invited Luther, tell us what we should do to reform the churches in our cities. Nuremberg was one of the first. Pirkheimer, the magistrate, was one of the first. And of course, the printing presses obviously helped as well. Erasmus, Luther, Melanchthon, Spalatin all mourned his passing. They all wrote very highly admiring encomiums of him. Beginning in the 19th century, he began to be called the Leonardo of the North. That nickname was not applied to him in his own lifetime. But in the 1800s, people began to say that's who he really was. He rivaled, if not exceeded, the skill and art of Leonardo da Vinci. And their lives overlapped. Next month, Elizabeth. 1515, born in 1533, she becomes queen in 1558, and she rules England for 45 years and presides over the English Renaissance. She is the patron of Shakespeare. She loved going to the theater, and he wrote plays with her in mind. He knew her taste. 44-year reign transformed England into a major world power, navigated religious turmoil, ushered in a golden age of literature, exploration, and cultural achievement. So we'll talk about all of that next month. I hope this was informative, helpful, maybe whet your appetite a little bit. I encourage you. As I said, the Faden Press book by Jeffrey Chip Smith would be the one I would recommend if you want to know more about Dürer. He's a fascinating figure. Thank you for coming out. for being my audience. And I hope you'll come back next month. Any questions? Comments? Anything you want to know more about?
Could you tell a little bit more about his relationship with his wife?
Oh, they never had any children, and we don't really know why, but they do seem to have been partners. She was his business manager. She managed the finances. She handled the distribution. She traveled independently. He jokes that when they went to Antwerp and they were going down the Rhine, the boatman brought gifts of wine and cheese for Agnes because they knew her. She'd been traveling through that area, and they knew her. And Dürer's like, how does he know my? Well, but and I think the portrait of Mine Agnes that he did just after their wedding betrays, in my mind, that little sketch betrays affection. And as I say, she managed the workshop when he was not there, when he made his trip to Venice to do the commission there. So it was a household, although they didn't have children, they had apprentices who lived in the household. She prepared the meal. She supervised, a cook and a maid and probably a household staff of 4 or 5. And she handled the money. Now, Dürer understood money, but she managed it.
She could have been the mastermind behind how to make the most money out of it.
Well, I think he already knew that. I think he knew from his days working for Michael Wohlgemuth and working on the books that Koberger was printing. I think he already had a grasp of all of that. And he may have taught her, but she figured it out on her own, and she's handling this network. I mean, his printed sheets are going to a dozen or more different salespeople in different cities. And she's handling the money, the sheets going out and the money coming back in, and probably giving him advice at the dinner table like, okay, here's what I think maybe you should try next. Do this. That was a big seller. Try this. I think they had that kind of a partnership. It's difficult. The letters, we do have letters back and forth, and the letters are sort of businesslike, but there also are some notes of affection from time to time. I think Panoski makes way too much of the fact that they didn't have children. Who knows why they didn't have children?
He didn't have a lot of oil paintings.
He,
Working on the press a lot.
he has a fair number. Probably not as many as Rembrandt. Rembrandt has 600. Dürer probably has less than 100. But that's still a fairly significant number, and a lot of commissioned artwork for churches that Dürer did. But he seems to have very quickly figured out, and in his manual for artists, he says you can make a lot more money from a black and white print that you can reproduce 200, 300, 400, 500 times than you can from an oil painting that you sell once.
And he was in it as a business.
Yes, he was. Yeah, and I encourage you, if you get to Germany, Nuremberg's one of the cities you should go visit. And if you visit Nuremberg, you should go to the Dürer house. It's worth, yeah.